So the topic of my talk tonight is, what do we mean when we talk about totalitarianism today? And I'm going to be talking about Hannah Arendt. I'm going to be calling her up from the past. Who was Hannah Arendt? Answer: she was a refugee and a migrant. She was born in Hanover, 1906, to Jewish secular parents. She moved to Königsberg, home of Immanuel Kant and the Enlightenment. She studied philosophy and theology with the key thinkers of her time: Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, Karl Jaspers. She went to Berlin after studying, where she was a journalist and a writer, and it was there that she fled Germany. She was working looking for propaganda materials in the National Library in 1933. She was caught by the Gestapo. Luckily, the Gestapo person who caught her was a rookie. He didn't really understand how to be a proper anti-Semite, and he was rather charmed by her, and so he let her go. She fled to Paris, where she worked with refugee children, sending them to Palestine. And when the war started, she was sent to Gurs camp in southwest France, the worst time of her life. When France was occupied, she escaped. She went to Marseille. She was an exception refugee, and she finally escaped to America in 1941. She was a stateless person for 51 years. Now, this refugee biography matters a lot for what I want to talk about this evening. Arendt was also a migrant, a refugee, in her words, a pariah thinker. She thought from the outside. And this was a very special place for her, this outside place. It was the advantage, she said, the advantage of the unprotected. And a very early work she wrote, this was she wrote in her 30s, late 20s, 30s, about Rahel Varnhagen. She has this wonderful statement, that's her Stateless Peoples documentation. Nobody understood the rain better. No one showed more clearly what rain was like than the person who happened to have no umbrella and therefore became soaking wet. That position, that pariah position, she kept throughout her life. Maintaining that space was why she tended to move between forms and disciplines. She was a restless thinker because she wasn't thinking from inside institutions. She was always without an umbrella. So, for examples, as a student, she studied philosophy and theology. She wrote her PhD thesis, it's wonderful, on Augustine. But she later rejected academic philosophy. She said, I don't want anything more to do with intellectual business. Why? Because people who she thought were the cleverest, most thoughtful people were so stupid they joined the Nazi Party. That was why. There was a limit to how clever you could be. She was always suspicious of specialists. Her idea of thinking is radically democratic. It begins with the position that we all think. And some of the best thinkers, she thought, were people outside universities. And I think she's probably right. So she was a philosopher, she was a theologian. When she left university and she'd had enough with academic work for a bit, she turned to life writing. She was a biographer. Her first book was a biography of the 18th century Jewish salonier Rahel Varnhagen. And this was a really experimental piece of biographical writing. It's very hard to tell whose voice is being passed in this piece of work. And she'd go on to write some fabulous pen portraits of key thinkers, poets, intellectuals, and of course Adolf Eichmann, for which she's best known. She was a historian. That's how she described origins of totalitarianism, but not a conventional historian. She really upset conventional historians when that book was published because she did not follow the protocols of traditional history. Why didn't she follow them? Because she was writing about a new thing that required new methods. She thought it was a travesty to try and wrap totalitarianism up with the kind of discourses we already had, because it had clearly broken the back of those discourses. And she actually began writing what would become Origins of Totalitarianism. It took her years. She was writing essays and reviews when she was in Paris in the 1930s, working with refugee children, working with refugee youth. And she later described herself in this period as a social worker who studied political philosophy in her spare time, which actually accurately describes a lot of my colleagues in IRIS. She was a political theorist, but she disliked political science. and was suspicious, very suspicious, of efforts to protect, direct, or control human behaviour. For my intellectual formation, what pleases me most is she's a profoundly literary writer. She was a poet, not a great poet, well, she was a better poet, but she was a poet. But she was also a writer who took risks with her own writing. There's another study to be done here about her relation to some of the most brilliant, daring, avant-garde women writers of her time. Mary McCarthy, Natalie Sarraute, Ingmar Bergman, Elizabeth Hardwick. She was also a literary experimentalist. The Human Condition, I don't know if any of you have read it, it's like nothing else on this planet. Every time I read that book, I think, what is this? I've never read this before in my life. What is it? Robert Lowell, the American poet, described Eichmann in Jerusalem as a new type of biography for a person without a soul. So this interdisciplinarity, if we can call it that, was not solution-driven, but multiple perspective-driven. You think your own thoughts, but in the place of somebody else, she told her students repeatedly. You think your own thoughts, but you put them in place of someone else. This is what enables judgment, which is, for her, the precondition of good politics. So I'm giving you this potted bio to make two introductory points. Would Arendt be happy to be the subject of an inaugural for an interdisciplinary chair? Yes, she would. She was interdisciplinary avant la lettre. And the second point I'm going to argue is we need this kind of imagination, an imagination unafraid, to pass Kant, to go visiting, if we are to understand what totalitarianism was and how to work out how best to defeat the totalitarian imagination, totalitarian thinking today. I'm going to circle back in the next half hour to the imagination, to arts, to the education, and to the importance of cultivating a prior perspective in the concluding part of this talk. When I start talking about art and literature, you know you're nearly done, okay? But first I want to introduce some key terms. Totalitarianism. When I started working on Hannah Arendt, no one really spoke about totalitarianism. It was a word that had sort of outgrown its use, and it snuck back. If you do one of those engrams, the cheap historians in the room won't like me for saying this, but cheap little way of finding out what's going on. Word totalitarianism has risen quite a lot in the last 10 years. In the 1960s, Arendt said that one of the most vivid experiences of totalitarianism was, and I quote, the experience of a trembling, wobbling motion of everything we rely on for our sense of direction and reality. A wobbling motion of everything we rely on. We are living in wobbly times. Not for nothing, in the months following Donald Trump's election in 2016, did The Origins of Totalitarianism crash onto the Amazon US bestseller list. In the first year of his presidency, overall sales of that book increased by over 1,000%. George Orwell was up there too. I date that moment as the moment when it became globally clear that a politics of the absurd and grotesque, the cruel, the mendacious, and the downright incredible had returned. Raising her hand from the 20th century, Hannah Arendt has things to say about this. First published in 1951 in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she described how in the 20th century historical conditions in Europe conspired to give evil a peculiarly modern formation. Political lies had triumphed over facts. People had given up on reality, messy, lovely, annoying, difficult reality, to live in a fiction. All that remained were power, violence, and ideology. How had this happened? Why had it happened? She asked. Now, Arendt located The Origins of Totalitarianism in Racism, Anti-Semitism, and Imperialism, and the first title of that book were Racism, Anti-Semitism, and Imperialism. The Burden of Our Time, Racism, Anti-Semitism, Imperialism, and what was the other one? The Pillars of Shame. I think it was an American publisher that pointed out to her that if you tried to sell a book in America called Racism, Anti-Semitism, when you're supposed to be saying how bad Europe is, it might not sell. So they dropped Racism and Imperialism from the main title, it's still in the subtitle, and called it The Origins of Totalitarianism, either stuff that happens over there, not in America, which still had Jewish quotas for universities and had the Jim Crow South and elsewhere. European anti-Semitism, she argued in the first part of the book, had turned a religious difference into race, that is, into an existential and absolute difference. This is an experience that she had, this is a history that she herself had experienced and lived. And the two key words in Arendt's studies and Arendt's mind are experience and understanding. That history ran in parallel to imperialism and colonialism. If you want to understand the origins of totalitarianism, look to imperialism, she said, and the relentless transformation of land and labour into pure wealth. She liked to quote Cecil Rhodes's mad statement on this point. Rhodes once said, "I would annex the planets if I could." I always think of Elon Musk, or I think actually has got plans to annex the planets when I hear that. Like Aimé Césaire, Orwell, W.E. Du Bois and others, Arendt believed that the horrors of colonialism and imperialism had boomeranged back to Europe to co-create the industrialised genocide that was the Shoah. So she did not think, well, she did think the Shoah was unique in Europe, but she actually thought what gave birth to that, what labelled that, had its history in colonialism and imperialism that had boomeranged back. Conditions in Europe had been prepared by war, unemployment, economic crisis after economic crisis, and a catastrophic failure of democratic politics. Rootlessness, homelessness, and loneliness defined the times. The stage was set, she said, for the cynical triumph of lies and conspiracy theories. Reality took leave, the wobbling became frantic. Quote, "The masses escape from reality," she wrote in a sentence from Origins that rears up into our own time, "is a verdict against the world in which they are forced to live and in which they cannot exist." The masses escape from reality is a verdict against the world in which they are forced to live, in which they cannot exist. That, she said, was how the impossible, the unimaginable, the camps, the corpse factories, the outright war, the lies, the dehumanisation became possible. Totalitarianism aimed at the complete elimination of human spontaneity. Far more terrifying than either authoritarianism or fascism, totalitarianism, the clue is in the name, went for total domination. It was an attack on both mind and body and ultimately on reality itself. So here's a second sentence from that book that resonates now and which has haunted me for the last 10 years. She says, "The crisis of our century is no mere threat from the outside, no mere result of some aggressive foreign policy of either Germany or Russia, and will no more disappear with the death of Stalin than it disappeared with the fall of Nazi Germany. It may even be that the true predicaments of our time will assume their authentic form, though not necessarily the cruelest, only when totalitarianism has become a thing of the past." In other words, you do not need a totalitarian regime to have totalitarian thinking or totalitarian imagination, and that is where I think we're heading at the moment. The true predicaments of our time. Do not assume you are safe, we can hear Arendt warning us about the false dawn that came with the end of Cold War. Do not think you're safe because totalitarian regimes have been defeated. Do not assume, and Václav Havel made the same point, that Western democracies, especially those run off consumer capitalism, are free of homelessness, rootlessness and loneliness. Do not assume that you know what it is to be free. Something had been permanently broken by the mid-20th century, Arendt said. Tradition, continuity, reality. And she likes to quote, she loved Shakespeare soliloquies. They're scattered all the way through her work and in her notebooks. She liked to quote Hamlet on this point, "The time is out of joint, O cursed spite that I was ever born to set it right." And I really do love this. It's a bit like she's going to play Hamlet. I mean, I'm just like, someone needs to do the production of Hamlet with Hannah Arendt as Hamlet. I'm looking at my Shakespeare colleagues here. Okay, so maybe we should not be too surprised that today many of the elements that Hannah Arendt first identified with totalitarian thinking have crept back into our political culture. And here are just a few to get us started. A cynical disenchantment with politics characterises our time as it did hers. So too does an inchoate hate ready to be directed at anything and anyone. Nothing, she wrote, perhaps illustrates the general disintegration of political life better than a vague, pervasive hatred of everyone and everything. Conspiracy theories flourish. Self-censorship is back. Many of us are lonely. We have now added the reality of the climate apocalypse to the threat of nuclear apocalypse. The tacit acceptance that there are certain categories of people, refugees, migrants, the uprooted, the occupied, the incarcerated, the permanently poor, whose lives are essentially superfluous, has not changed much since the Second World War. Camps and ghettos have changed their names, locations and appearances, but the misery remains, as does the thoughtlessly cruel administration of human beings, as though they were little more than freight. Witness our border politics. Witness Gaza, an industrial-scale slaughter in real time, as Pankaj Mishra described it in London last week, happening right under our noses, in plain sight. So let's dig deeper. What about now? What is totalitarianism now? What does it even mean to talk about totalitarianism today when the state, at least in modern neoliberal societies, appears to have withdrawn? When we are told there are no big ideologies, and certainly no big ideas, left. No big all-controlling parties, only positions, increasingly implacable positions. So I'm going to offer 4 interlinked answers. I'm sure you can add your own. First, the state and big parties have not withdrawn everywhere. Korea, the ultimate retro-totalitarian state. China has been demonstrating that mass surveillance and re-education camps are apparently not incompatible with capitalism. Iran, Afghanistan, Islamic State fits Arendt's definition of totalitarianism as far from being monolithic as thriving on a relentless drive to violence. And then there is Russia. In 2017, i.e. not that long ago, the last 5 years have really been crazy. Not that long ago, the Russian-American journalist Masha Gessen published a book with the title The Future is History: How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. It's a brilliant book. It's an epic history of how the hope of the Glasnost years ended up with one-man rule of Vladimir Putin. And they do it really, really brilliantly. It's told through about 5 people biography, my generation, the kind of Glasnost generation. And Masha Gessen relates their stories all the way up to the present, so you can see what's happened in that lifetime to create the situation we're in now. Now, when Gessen published that book, critics at that time called their use of totalitarianism in the title extravagant. Political scientists and historians complain that Gessen didn't really understand totalitarianism. They also say this about Arendt a lot. Gessen, who is now non-binary, had to leave Russia in 2013 amid fears that her children would be taken away from them. Extravagant? Many now, including Vladimir Putin, would agree that currently Russia is quite keen on repeating its history, particularly its imperial history. There's no secret about that. And also, I mean, everyone knows this, 2 years ago, following the invasion of Ukraine, Lucia Stein, who's a member of Pussy Riot, the protest punk group, smuggled herself, she was under house arrest from Moscow, disguised as a delivery rider. And I was overjoyed to discover, well, I wasn't overjoyed to discover this because I'd rather she didn't have to be escaping from anywhere, but in her backpack she had her pet rat, her PlayStation, and a copy of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, with the 3 things she was taking from Moscow as an instruction manual this time. Often, as I said before, and like Hannah Arendt herself, the best students of totalitarianism are those who are trying to work out what is happening to them, to think through the fog, to understand experience. I go back to my original point here about the special perspective of a pariah knowledge earlier. Nobody understands the rain better than those without umbrellas. Masha Gessen was also recently caught up in another strange, there's this way in the last 10 years that Arendt has gone entangled in actual history. And this is another one of these examples. Gessen was caught up in another story, an Arendtian story, in December, when the Hannah Arendt Prize, which is a prize that awards people who contribute to public political thought in the tradition of Hannah Arendt, was temporarily withdrawn and watered down following an article that Gessen had written comparing Gaza with Jewish ghettos under the Nazis. Gessen is Jewish. leading a friend of mine to quip accurately that even Hannah Arendt would not get the Hannah Arendt Prize today, which is actually true. So, Russia, of course, is not alone in the persecution of LGBTQ plus people and increasingly conservative politics of women and the family. And this is going to be my second point. Gender, along with migrant politics, are the new front line for authoritarians, and it's feeding a particular totalitarian imagination. Over the past 10 years, for women, queer and trans people, as for refugees and migrants, total state control has not withdrawn, but increased. And this is global. As Judith Butler has argued in their new book, which was published just this week, when it comes to gender, there's a kind of authoritarian internationalism. So in the US, for example, we had the taking down of Roe versus Wade and the attempt to manufacture a reality where women will not seek abortions. This is widely seen as an opening salvo in a more sustained set of attacks on gay marriage, etc., gay rights and women's rights. Vladimir Putin has described gayology, which is wonderful, I wish we could have it on the syllabus, as a terrible Western invention and declared it a threat to Russian national security. Hungary's Viktor Orban, Brazil's Bolsonaro until 2022, Argentina's Milei, Italy's Meloni. Name your authoritarian and he and she will have strong views about other people's bodies and what they are allowed to do with them. Now, to be clear, these are not totalitarian regimes, but some are authoritarian or have authoritarian ambitions. This is not so much a totalitarian system as a stirring up of totalitarian passions and totalitarian imaginations. Let us not forget that for Arendt, another characteristic of totalitarian ideology is the relentless need to create enemies. You have to keep on creating enemies for the thing to work, even when those enemies are powerless. So the Nazis were still bleating on about Jewish plots even when they decimated most of the Jews of Europe. You know, there's a Jewish plot. And you get the same logic. So it's the refugee who is a threat. It's the trans person who can't get care who is a threat. Compare to harder and harder policies against migrants and refugees, a category of people who are particularly subject to the distinctly totalitarian fantasy that they might somehow be simply made to disappear. Another quote that rears into the present from the past. On the right there is Gurs Camp, where Arendt was sent by the French. Go there today, it looks completely different. She said, "It is as though mankind has divided itself between those who believe in human omnipotence, who think anything is possible if one knows how to organise the masses for it, and those for whom powerlessness has become the major experience of their lives." And I think this is true now. There's concentration of mad power and complete powerlessness. So how do we get back to, if we ever really left, the idea that there were some people whose lives were essentially superfluous? One of the most acute theorists of totalitarianism was the literary theorist Tzvetan Todorov, who was born in Bulgaria in 1939 and lived his adult life in France. Before his death in 2017, same year as Gessen's book, Todorov warned that there were developments in the West which, without repeating the past, were assuming totalitarian characteristics. One point he made at that time has struck me recently to be retrospectively rather true. Don't think, he said, that the principles of free market individualism are any the less ideological than the totalitarianism its proponents think they're guarding against. Quote, "In communist totalitarianism," he said, "the state attacked and controlled the market," which is why it was a disaster. In neoliberalism, quote, "the market attacks and dominates politics, including the state." I thought this was real overclaim when I first read it in 2011. But I had yet to experience Liz Truss's full-throated ideological assault on the UK economy and the effect not only on individual incomes and homes, which have been devastating, but on our capacity to live as communities of care and interconnectedness. The result then, Todorov continued, is the sidelining of the losers as true waste products of the system, condemned to both poverty and scorn, They are the cause of their own misfortune, and we should not call upon the state to help them. From this point of view, he said, ultraliberalism, which is a word I think I prefer to neoliberalism, ultraliberalism is fully charged, shares the cult of the supermen and is reminiscent of the precepts of Nietzsche. It's not a coincidence, I think, that Todorov, who lived through totalitarianism, was in fact, the great theorist of the fantastic uncanny. If our world wobbles precariously right now, this is because so much of it is mediated virtually online, in a space where, as with the uncanny, we encounter strangely alarming versions of ourselves. Others have pointed to a lack of political accountability of big tech companies, and Arendt also was very worried about big corporations in America taking political power, as it were, under the table, and they were already operating at a level that was not democratically accountable, given the influence they had. Arendt, on this subject, raising her hand and probably at this point beginning to wave it rather frantically, would be asking what is happening to privacy, spontaneity, let alone the ability to conduct a politics of plurality in this over-socialised space, in the mirror world, as Naomi Klein has recently called it. Now, Arendt was in some ways there at the beginning of all this. In 1955, she went to visit Stanford University in California and visited the then brand new Centre for the Study of Behavioural Science, the home, as it were, the origin of the people science that more recently has underpinned our online lives. She was not impressed. And she said, the problem with modern theories of behaviourism is not that they were wrong, but that they could become true. She later remarked. She also, in Our Violence, one of her last texts, predicted that the age of robot soldiers was upon us, and at which point, when they started deciding what strategy was, we were in real trouble. The possibilities of behavioural and thus political control, as is now well understood, including by colleagues in this university, are now greater than anything the authoritarians and totalitarians of the last century could have dreamt up. So those are my 4 points. In the late 1950s, Hannah Arendt warned us of 2 types of alienation that she feared were now endemic. They weren't going anywhere. World alienation, where we have become alienated from the world we make together, and earth alienation, whereby we become alienated from the earth itself, the place we live with all other life. Nothing in the first 2 decades of the 21st century persuades me that she was wrong. So, I feel like Lenin now. What is to be done? Totalitarianism, remember, Arendt said, attacks human experience. It makes us doubt our sense of reality. And so too, that sense that the world is plural, shared with others, and complex, all of which is crucial to politics. Over the past 10 years, and past 6 years in particular, I've been struck and in fact cheered by the fact that it's been writers and artists who've not only been using the word rather fearlessly, totalitarianism, where others fear to tread, but also using their media and developing new forms of understanding its current structures and reach. There's a way back to common experience, or a way forward to common experience, in other words. I'm going to finish by suggesting, and the arts and humanities, along with Hannah Arendt, have something to say about that. Take, for example, a book that I know a lot of you here will know very well, Anna Burns's brilliant, luminous, 2018 Booker-winning The Milkman. I didn't realise that Burns had used the word totalitarianism 3 times until I read about it in a book by a distinguished historian of totalitarianism who was telling her off for misusing it. Burns, you'll remember, describes 1970s Catholic Belfast as a totalitarian enclave. The historian conceded that she got some of the atmosphere of surveillance and intrusion right, but complained that there was no intent to dominate presented and no real system of repression developed in the novel. The same historian described Gesson's use of the word totalitarianism as unthinking and casual. There's a pattern, there's a really long history here. It's even a casual glance on the Arendt scholarship on criticising her version of totalitarianism demonstrates it's hard not to detect the whiff of misogyny in the willingness to prove her wrong. I mean, I could have really titled this lecture What Women, Queer and Non-Binary People Are Talking About When They Talk About Totalitarianism and Why Some Men Really Don't Like It. And I'm not exactly being facetious there either. I think Burns's use, like Gesson's use of totalitarian, was deliberately anachronistic. Her book, like Gesson's, was not only about the late 20th century, but was a warning from just 6 years ago about where we were heading, which is where we are now. In Prophet Song, last year's another Booker-winning Irish novel, dystopia about a future totalitarian Ireland, Paul Lynch explicitly uses a phrase from Hannah Arendt, the big lie, to make the link between then, now and the future. And we should have a conversation over a glass of wine about why it is that it's Irish writers who are leading the way on this critique. Now, readers of The Milkman will remember that Burns's key character, Middle Sister, expresses her resistance and disobedience by reading books, particularly novels, and reading books in public. Her best friend describes her deviant behaviour as reading while walking, and I think a lot of us probably did that in this room too. And she says, even worse than reading and walking, you read books and you make notes on them. This really deviant behaviour, which pretty much describes what we do in the humanities too. When Arendt was visiting the Behavioural Sciences Centre at Stanford, she was actually spending a semester at Berkeley teaching students political science. And here's a glimpse of her syllabus. I must say, if anyone's keeping an archive, I could lose myself in people's syllabi. It's so revealing and interesting, and much more clear. So if you're going to keep anything, keep your teaching notes. You can throw the rest away. I mean, there's really clarity that's to be had from a teaching archive. So this is her syllabus for political science, 110. And what I love most about this is the presence of novels and testimonies. She's teaching political science, but she's teaching Faulkner, Hemingway, Brecht, David Rosset, George Orwell, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre. This list is as male and pale as possible, but it's also quietly deviant, as in Burns's sense. She was putting the world of human experience back on the table in her classroom. Imagination, she told her students, and I'm quoting directly from her teaching notes here, is a prerequisite of understanding. You should imagine how the world looks from the point of view of where these people are located, she said. The assumption is it is the common world of all of us, and that is what is between you and this other location. It was Kant's enlarged mentality that Arendt was training her students in. She was teaching about European totalitarianism to sunny 1950s Californian students who would have been mainly white, mainly well off, and had no idea. She was teaching them to think through history, to think through others. The ability to represent the experience of others in one's mind, even though we have not actually had that experience ourselves. This, to quote Burns again, is a normality trying to happen amid the wobbling and the trembling. It's anti-totalitarian teaching. We keep up updating the syllabi and arguing about the syllabi, but in essence this is what we do in the humanities and the social sciences. We create spaces where experiences, plural, different, difficult, can be shared. And in doing that, we're also insisting upon a common and a real world. We're claiming that common world back. We're claiming a normality back. Education, Arendt also wrote, is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it and by the same token, save it. Education in this sense is anti-totalitarian, and I think we need to be saying this much more loudly and clearly just now. One final point about imagination and the spaces we need to protect. Like writers, visual artists too have and increasingly been claiming experience back from lies and political violence, and often adopting explicitly Arendtian strategies whilst doing so. In Iran, which is a front line, not the front line against 21st century style totalitarianism, artists and activists following the protests against the murder of Mahsa Amini have taken to the streets, but they do it at night. And what they do is they rework the street furniture. They subvert it. They make it uninhabitable for the police. They're ironic. They paint. And reworking the street into forms of protest. And as the curator and British-based art historian Neda Mohammadi explained to me recently, the point is to remain visible in a public space, the requirement for Arendt for political life, and two, through art, make a common world other than the violently imposed one of the regime. These spaces for appearing, for debate, for plurality, are getting more and more difficult to protect, not just in Iran, which I think is one of the clearest indications of the traces of a totalitarian imagination. In February this year, Cuban artist Tania Bruguera arranged for a 100-hour reading of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism in a museum in Berlin. This is, if you're an Arendt scholar, this is your ideal fun. We're going to read all of Origins of Totalitarianism for 100 hours non-stop. And actually, I did do a reading, an online reading on the last American election where we read the last part for 24 hours. It's worth doing. The point was to let Arendt's warnings from the last century resonate in a public space. The readers included artists, academics, writers and volunteers. When Bruguera had staged a similar intervention back in Cuba, where she comes from, the authorities had tried to drown out the reading by using hammer drills outside the place that it was happening in, and they eventually arrested her. She was already under house arrest when she arranged the event. In Germany last month, the event opened with a reading out of all the names of writers, artists and academics who had been cancelled or told off or stopped in Germany, having spoken out against the war in Gaza, including Masha Gessen, who also read. Halfway through the reading, there was a protest by pro-Palestinian supporters, which was timed to coincide with Miriam Wenzel's reading. Wenzel is the director of the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt and an Arendt scholar. The exchange was heated, tense, shouty, and eventually the museum and the artist cancelled the event and cancelled the reading. The experiment in creating an Arendtian space, a public space, necessarily open to conflict, disagreement, difficulty and a debate, a space dedicated to imagining how the world looks like from a different point of view of your own. All the things I've been advocating and enthusing for this evening had failed. People were understandably distraught. My editor and friend Dirk Setten wrote to me in a quote, "Germany's cultural institutions and universities are a mess right now," he wrote. "It's horrible." And then he added, "It's still strange why a blatant political conflict manifests itself in Germany, primarily in universities and in art institutions." I replied that I thought the reason why political conflict manifests itself in art institutions and universities is that these are places where people historically have been able to bring difficult realities into the world. I still think that. I think that's partly what we do. But I also think that the more the governments crack down on political protests, the more likely that frustration, rage, and yes, possibly intolerance and violence will get into our institutions. In Germany's case, there are specific histories at work, as we all know. But current language about mob rule, and even the ever-increasing expanding definition of extremism that we're expecting later this week from our own government should make anyone in the arts or education nervous. It will come back to us. I end on this down note, not out of pessimism. I'm really actually quite cheerful. But I hope in true Arendtian style to acknowledge the seriousness of what we're now up against. Comprehension, Arendt wrote, means the unpremeditated, attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. She also said, this is my favourite quote from Arendt, "We humanise what is going on in the world and in ourselves only by speaking of it. And in the course of speaking it, we learn to be human." Thank you for letting me speak about what I think is going on in the world and for the opportunity here among us all to keep on learning how to be human. Thank you.